Hello, everyone. I'm the storyteller, and I'm here to help you sleep and relax. But before we begin, I would like to know which city you're from and what time you're watching this. Before we start, click the like button and subscribe to the channel. Now, let's begin. Get comfortable and relax. It wasn't the first time I'd gotten lost out here, but this time I had no one to blame but myself. My name's Eric Scott, and I've been a park ranger at Olympic National Park in Washington since 2002. It's a place where the rainforest seems to stretch on forever, where every trail blurs into the next, and where even seasoned rangers like me can make mistakes. Some days the moss looks like it's swallowing the world whole, and other days it's peaceful, too peaceful. Maybe on those peaceful days, my mind drifts to things like how my ex-wife used to complain about how I smelled after work. She was right, of course. A long day in a damp forest does leave you smelling like a wet dog, but you get used to it after a while. That was one of the many things that drove us apart. The forest took precedence over our marriage. "You love those trees more than you love me," she'd say. I never corrected her because I couldn't honestly say she was wrong. The ranger station was quiet that morning in early spring 2007. The tourist season hadn't kicked into high gear yet, which meant most of my time was spent on maintenance, paperwork, and listening to Matthew, my supervisor, complain about budget cuts. I preferred it this way. I always joked that being a ranger gave me more opportunities to avoid people, not meet them. "Got something for you, Scott," Matthew said, dropping a folder on my desk. His face was weathered from decades in the elements, lines etched deep around his eyes like the rings of an old-growth cedar. "Had a few hikers come in with complaints about Callow Creek." "Complaints?" I asked, flipping through the reports. "Nobody even goes out there this time of year." "Apparently some folks do. Said they found broken branches, trampled undergrowth, weird noises," Matthew shrugged. "Probably just deer or maybe a rogue bear, but we need to check it out." "I'll go," I said, perhaps too eagerly. Callow Creek wasn't on the main visitor paths. It was perfect for getting away. "Take Daniel with you," Matthew suggested, referring to the newest ranger, a kid barely out of college. "I'll be fine alone," I insisted. "Don't want to waste manpower on a wild goose chase." Matthew gave me a look I knew well, concern mixed with resignation. He'd been around long enough to know when I needed space. "Radio check-ins every hour, Scott. I mean it." I nodded, already mentally walking the trail in my head. Callow Creek was beautiful this time of year, with wildflowers just starting to peek through the winter-dampened earth. Plus, it had been weeks since I'd been out that way. Something about that area always drew me back. As I gathered my gear, I caught Daniel watching me. He was a good kid, eager to learn, but with that city-bred wariness of the deep woods that always amused me. "You sure you don't want backup?" he asked, his voice careful not to sound too concerned. "It's just a routine check," I replied, checking my radio. "Besides, someone needs to stay and handle the throngs of tourists." I gestured to the empty visitor center. He laughed. "At least take your sidearm. Protocol for wildlife investigations, right?" I waved him off. "It's just going to be some deer. Back by dinner." Looking back, I can still feel the weight of that decision, the casual dismissal of precaution. The forest had always been kind to me, or at least that's what I thought. I'd spent thousands of hours beneath those ancient trees, had memorized every trail, creek, and overlook within my section. The Olympic wilderness was more home to me than any house I'd ever lived in. I parked my truck at the Callow Creek trailhead just after noon. The air was thick with moisture, that distinctive Pacific Northwest dampness that seems to seep into your bones. The trail ahead disappeared into a wall of green, ferns, and moss-draped trees, creating a natural archway. I shouldered my pack and stepped into the forest's embrace. I couldn't have known then what waited for me down that trail. Couldn't have guessed that the peace I found in these woods would be shattered, or that I'd discover something that would haunt me for years to come. As I walked deeper into the forest, the canopy thickened overhead, filtering the sunlight into ghostly beams that barely reached the forest floor. Looking back now, I should have noticed how quiet it was. No bird song, no rustling of small creatures in the underbrush. Just the sound of my boots on the damp earth and my own breathing. The forest was holding its breath, and somewhere deep in those ancient woods, something was waiting. I had volunteered to check out the Callow Creek Trail after a few complaints from hikers. Broken branches, trampled undergrowth, the usual. Honestly, it sounded like deer or maybe a rogue bear, but no one had actually seen anything. Callow Creek wasn't on the main visitor paths, so it was perfect for getting away, which, looking back, I guess should have been a red flag. It's always the quiet places that hide the most trouble. The radio crackled a few times as I started down the trail, but it was nothing intelligible. Typical out here. These old radios are more stubborn than my dad was, and that's saying something. And I had enough signal to report in that I was on the trail, and everything looked fine. The first mile showed nothing unusual, just the expected seasonal changes and some deer tracks. It was around the 2nd mile marker when things started feeling off. The trail began to narrow, hemmed in by ferns that seemed to reach for my ankles as I passed. I noticed broken branches, yes, but not in the way animals typically leave them. These were snapped at odd heights, some nearly 7 feet up. Too high for deer, wrong pattern for bear. I took photos, made notes in my little waterproof notebook. Then it hit me, the smell. Rotting meat, pungent and thick, like it had been sitting in the sun for days. Now I've smelled plenty of dead animals in my time, but this was worse, much worse. It stuck to the back of my throat, making me gag. My first thought was that I'd find a bear carcass or something, maybe the victim of poachers, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I followed the stench deeper into the woods, where the trees clustered so tight it was hard to tell where one ended and the next began. The air felt denser, the kind of humidity that clings to your skin like a layer of sweat. My radio hissed with static when I tried to check in. No signal. I hesitated, considered turning back. Protocol said to return to range when communications failed, but I was already this far, and the source of that smell couldn't be much farther. 5 more minutes, I told myself, just a quick look. I stumbled upon a clearing, not one that I recognized, which was weird because I knew the area like the back of my hand. There was something wrong here, though. The ground was uneven, as if something heavy had dragged itself across the dirt. It was littered with bones, scattered, broken. Some picked clean, others still attached to what looked like old, rotted flesh. Deer? Elk, maybe? But no bear. I wasn't the type to get spooked easily, but something about this just felt off, like walking into a trap without realizing it. I radioed in again. Nothing but static. For the first time in a long while, I felt a prickle of unease, the kind you don't ignore. "Hello?" I called out, instantly regretting it. My voice seemed to disappear into the dense air, absorbed by the moss and the trees. Anyone there? I took photos, careful documentation that would later vanish from my camera without explanation. The clearing was rough, circular, about 30 feet across. At its center, the bones were piled higher, almost deliberately arranged, not the random scatter of natural predation. I'd seen kill sites before, cougars, bears, wolves, and none looked like this. As I circled the clearing, I noticed crude markings on some of the trees. Not blazes from rangers or trail markers, but deep gouges in the bark, too high and too deep for any animal I knew. Some formed patterns that almost resembled primitive symbols. I was about to leave, making a mental note to come back with another ranger later when I heard it. A low scraping sound. Something was moving. Fast. I froze. Instinct kicked in and my hand went to my side for my gun. But then I remembered I hadn't brought one. Stupid, right? But it was supposed to be a routine check. No need for a weapon when you're just hiking through peaceful woods, right? Idiot. The sound got louder, closer. My heartbeat hammered in my ears, drowning out everything else. I backed up real slow, trying to scan the tree line. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. It came crashing through the underbrush, moving like nothing I'd ever seen before. At first glance, it looked like a mountain lion, but bigger, and its gait was all wrong. Twisted. Its body was long, too long for anything that lived in these woods. Its skin stretched tight over visible ribs, and its legs moved in jerky, unnatural motions like a puppet with tangled strings. It had fur patchy and matted with what I could only assume was blood. It didn't growl, it just stared, waiting. I took a step back, my boot crunching against a dry branch, and that was enough. It lunged at me, faster than I could react, knocking me off my feet. I hit the ground hard, the air rushing out of my lungs. My hands scrambled for anything, a rock, a stick, anything, but my fingers just dug into wet soil. I could feel its breath, hot and rancid against my neck, and my vision blurred with panic. I was going to die out here, mauled by some creature that shouldn't even exist. Suddenly there was a scream, not mine, human. From the other side of the clearing, it distracted the thing long enough for me to kick it off, scrambling to my feet. I couldn't see who it was, but I heard them. A man yelling. He ran into view, swinging a thick branch like his life depended on it. He smashed it against the creature's head, and it let out a shriek, retreating into the woods faster than it had appeared. I staggered to my feet, gasping, as the man ran over to me. "You okay?" he asked. He was taller than me, built like a lumberjack, his face flushed from the effort. I recognized him now. Daniel, the new ranger. He must have followed me, despite my insistence on going alone. "What the hell was that?" I managed to say between breaths. "No idea," he muttered, glancing at the tree line. "We need to get out of here." We didn't argue, we just ran. Every crunch of the leaves behind us made my heart leap into my throat. But nothing chased us. Nothing followed. We reached the main trail, and only then did I feel like I could breathe again. Daniel was just as shaken as I was. He kept looking over his shoulder like he expected it to jump out of the shadows at any moment. "We need to report this," he said, his voice steady but his hand shaking. "Whatever that was, it's dangerous." We made our way back to the station in silence, each lost in our own thoughts. Once we got there, I picked up the radio and tried to call it in, but of course, nothing but static. It wasn't until I used the landline that I got through to the main office. They didn't believe us. Not really. Not that I could blame them. Who would? Matthew looked at us like we'd lost our minds. "Let me get this straight," he said slowly, rubbing his graying temples. "You're saying you saw some kind of mutant mountain lion in an area that's been thoroughly surveyed for decades?" "I know how it sounds," I admitted. "But we both saw it. It wasn't natural, Matthew, the way it moved. And this clearing, full of bones," Matthew interrupted, "which isn't on any of our maps." Daniel nodded emphatically. "The smell alone was unlike anything I've experienced. And those markings on the trees. Probably just old lightning strikes," Matthew dismissed. "Look, I'm not saying you didn't see something, but stress and isolation can play tricks on the mind. We're going back tomorrow," I insisted, "with more rangers. You'll see." Matthew sighed the way he always did when he knew arguing would be pointless. "Fine. First thing tomorrow. But no talking about this to anyone else. Last thing we need is rumors scaring away visitors." That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that thing. Its unnatural gait, the way its joints bent at impossible angles. Those eyes, empty, yet somehow ancient. I got up around 3 a.m. and started researching on my personal laptop. Olympic National Park had its share of folklore, spirits in the woods, creatures from Native American legend, but nothing matched what we'd seen. I came across mentions of disappearances over the years, hikers who ventured out and never returned. Most were attributed to exposure, disorientation, or wildlife attacks. Perfectly reasonable explanations. But reading between the lines, I noticed a pattern. Many occurred in the general vicinity of Cow Creek. The next morning, we assembled a team: Matthew, myself, Daniel, and two other senior rangers, Maria and Dwayne. We geared up properly this time with sidearms, cameras, sample collection kits. No one would say it, but there was skepticism written all over their faces. "Lead the way," Matthew said, his tone making it clear he expected this to be a waste of time. The hike to Cow Creek seemed different in daylight, with company. The forest felt ordinary again, birds calling, squirrels darting between trees. I began to doubt myself. Had we really seen what we thought we saw? Was it possible we'd somehow exaggerated the experience in our minds? But then we reached the spot where the trail should have led to the clearing. I stopped, confused. "It was right here," I said, pointing through the dense underbrush, "just beyond those cedars." Daniel nodded. "Yeah, that's where we ran from." We pushed through, expecting to find the bone-littered clearing. Instead, we found nothing. Just more forest. More trees, more ferns, more moss. No clearing. No bones. No strange markings on the trees. "I don't understand," I muttered, spinning around. "It was right here." Maria and Dwayne exchanged looks. Matthew's expression hardened. "Let's spread out. Search the area. Maybe you got turned around yesterday." For hours, we combed the surrounding forest. Nothing. No evidence of anything unusual. Even the trampled undergrowth and broken branches that had initially brought me out here seemed to have disappeared. "The smell," Daniel said desperately. It was unmistakable. "You can't tell me you don't smell anything." The others shook their heads. I couldn't smell it either. Not anymore. It was as if the forest had swallowed all evidence of what we'd seen. Back at the station, the report was filed away as a probable bear sighting, despite our protests. Daniel and I were the only witnesses, and without evidence, our account sounded like the ramblings of two men who'd spent too much time alone in the woods. That night at the local bar where rangers sometimes gathered after shifts, an older man overheard us discussing what happened. He was a member of the Quit tribe, his face deeply lined with age. He slid onto the stool next to mine. "You saw it, didn't you?" he asked quietly. "In the deep woods." I looked at him sharply. "Saw what?" "The Stick Indians call it Kedi," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The ancient one. Not quite animal, not quite spirit. It guards places where the boundary between worlds is thin." Daniel leaned in. "What does it want?" The old man shrugged. "To be left alone, mostly. But it grows angry when people disturb its territory." "Have others seen it?" I asked. "Few see it and live to tell," he replied. "Those bones you found, they were offerings, warnings. The forest keeps its secrets, Ranger. Some things aren't meant to be understood by outsiders." He left soon after, leaving us with more questions than answers. Daniel looked at me, his eyes wide. "You think that's real? This Kedi thing?" I didn't know what to think anymore. But I knew what I'd seen, and no official report or skeptical colleagues could convince me otherwise. Something was out there in my forest, something that shouldn't exist, but did. Daniel quit 2 weeks later, said he couldn't sleep, kept hearing strange noises outside his cabin at night. I didn't blame him, but I stayed. Some compulsion kept me there, a need to understand what we'd encountered. The rangers stopped talking about the incident. Life at Olympic National Park returned to normal. But I couldn't forget. And I couldn't shake the feeling that it, whatever it was, hadn't forgotten me either. A month passed. Spring bloomed fully across Olympic National Park, bringing cascades of tourists and their predictable problems. Lost hikers, minor injuries, bear sightings too close to campsites. I went through the motions of my job, but my mind remained fixated on what had happened at Cow Creek. During off hours, I dug deeper into research. The Quit elders' mention of Kedi led me down rabbit holes of Pacific Northwest indigenous folklore. I found scattered references to similar creatures, guardian spirits who protected sacred places, shapeshifters who punished those who violated the forest's sanctity. The descriptions varied, but certain elements remained consistent: unnatural movement, an ability to appear and disappear at will, and a connection to boundaries between worlds. I created a map marking historical disappearances and unusual animal behavior throughout the park. A pattern emerged, a rough circle about 12 miles in diameter with Cow Creek near its center, too consistent to be coincidence. Matthew noticed my obsession. "You need to let this go, Scott," he told me one evening, concern evident in his voice. "Whatever you and Daniel thought you saw." "We know what we saw," I interrupted, "and I'm going to prove it." "Is that why you've been requesting all those old incident reports? Harassing the tribal liaison with questions about folk legends?" I hadn't realized my inquiries had been so noticeable. "I'm just being thorough," Matthew sighed. "Look, I've been in these woods for 30 years. There's plenty of strange stuff out there, bears, cougars, the occasional wolf, but there's no monster. Then how do you explain what happened? The clearing that disappeared? The bones? Stress, isolation. Maybe you two stumbled on an old animal carcass and your minds filled in the rest." He put a hand on my shoulder. "Take some time off, Carlos. Clear your head." Instead, I waited until my next scheduled 3-day weekend and packed my gear. This time I was prepared. Camera with extra batteries, GPS tracker, sidearm, provisions for several days. I told no one where I was going, but left a sealed envelope on my kitchen table with coordinates and instructions to be opened if I didn't return. I returned to Cow Creek at dawn. The forest felt different this time. Expectant. Almost as if it had been waiting for me. I followed the familiar trail, careful to mark my path with small pieces of surveyor's tape. At the point where Daniel and I had encountered the clearing, I stopped and surveyed the area carefully. Nothing seemed unusual in the daylight, just trees, ferns, the occasional wildflower. I sat on a fallen log and waited. Hours passed. The forest's ambient sounds, birds, insects, the rustling of small mammals, continued uninterrupted. No strange smells. No unnatural silence. As evening approached, I considered making camp, but something told me to keep moving. I left the trail, pushing deeper into the unmarked wilderness, following what seemed like game trails, but they weren't quite right. Too direct, too purposeful for animal paths. The sun was setting when I found it. Not the same clearing as before, but similar. A circular space where trees should have been, but weren't. The ground was bare except for a thick carpet of moss, unnaturally green and lush. In the center stood a single stump, ancient and massive, its surface polished smooth as if by centuries of touch. I approached cautiously, camera ready. The stump was covered in carvings, symbols similar to what I'd glimpsed on the trees in the first clearing. Some appeared to depict animals. Others resembled no imagery I recognized. As I circled it, I noticed something odd. There was no root system visible. The stump simply emerged from the ground as if it had grown that way. The air grew cold as darkness fell. I set up a small camp at the edge of the clearing, building a fire more for comfort than warmth. As flames licked the gathered branches, I felt it, that sense of being watched that rangers develop after years in the wilderness. But this was more intense, more directed. "I know you're out there." I called into the darkness beyond my firelight. "I'm not leaving until we talk." Silence answered me, but the feeling intensified. I kept my hand near my sidearm, eyes scanning the tree line. The fire crackled, sending sparks upward into the night sky. A twig snapped to my left. I turned slowly, deliberately, and saw nothing at first. Then movement. Something emerged from between two massive Douglas firs, its form seeming to bend and reshape as it entered the clearing. It wasn't exactly like what we'd seen before. This time it appeared almost human-shaped, but wrong. Too tall, limbs too long, movements too fluid to be natural. Its skin, if you could call it that, was the color of wet bark. And its face, I can barely describe it even now. Features that shifted and changed as if unable to decide on a final form. I didn't run. Couldn't run. Fear froze me in place as it approached, circling my camp with that same unnatural gait that had haunted my nightmares for weeks. It made no sound, but I could feel its focus. It's curiosity. Ketty, I whispered, the name feeling strange on my tongue. It stopped, head tilting at an impossible angle. Then, to my horror and amazement, it spoke, not with a voice, but somehow directly into my mind. Not words exactly, but impressions, images, emotions. Watcher, guardian, ancient. I saw flashes of the forest through centuries, trees growing, dying, being reborn. I saw people come and go, some respectful, others destructive. I saw the boundaries between worlds thinning at certain places, certain times, and this thing, this guardian, protecting those boundaries. The bones, I managed to ask. The animals, offerings, necessary. Balance. More images flooded my mind, the natural cycle of life and death, but guided, managed by something beyond human understanding. This entity didn't kill for sport or food, but as part of some greater purpose I couldn't fully comprehend. Why show yourself to me? To Daniel? Warning. Territory. Encroachment. I understood then the complaints that had brought me to Cow Creek in the first place, people venturing where they shouldn't, disturbing places meant to remain untouched. This thing was a caretaker of sorts, a guardian of boundaries both physical and metaphysical. It moved closer, its form seeming to flicker and shift in the firelight. I felt its attention focus entirely on me, assessing, judging. In that moment, I knew my life hung in the balance of whatever decision it made. You belong. You understand. The words, no, the feeling came with a sense of acceptance. Not friendship, nothing so human, but recognition. It saw something in me that it respected. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. Not running or walking away, but simply ceasing to be there. As if it had stepped through some invisible doorway. I sat awake the rest of the night, my fire burning low, my mind racing with what I'd experienced. By morning, I wasn't entirely sure it had happened at all. But the clearing remained, and the stump with its ancient carvings. I took photos, knowing somehow they wouldn't develop properly. Later, as I packed to leave, I noticed something at the base of the stump that hadn't been there before, a single claw, curved and sharp, unlike any animal part I'd seen. I picked it up carefully, feeling its unnatural weight, and placed it in my pocket. Proof. Finally, something tangible. We went back the next day with more rangers, but when we reached the clearing, it was empty. No bones, no creature, just the same damp, moss-covered ground. Daniel and I exchanged a glance, but neither of us said anything. No one else mentioned the smell either. It's been years since that day, and I still don't know what we saw. We filed our report, but it was brushed off as a bear sighting, despite the fact that neither of us believed that for a second. I stayed on as a ranger, but Daniel quit not long after, said he didn't feel safe anymore. I don't blame him. The claw I brought back from my solo expedition disappeared from my drawer one night. No forced entry, no explanation, just gone as if it had never existed. For months, I obsessively returned to different parts of that 12-meter circle I'd mapped, searching for another encounter. Sometimes I found unusual clearings, sometimes strange markings on trees, but never again the direct experience of that night by the fire. Part of me was relieved. Another part was disappointed. Matthew eventually called me into his office, concern evident in his expression. "You're one of my best rangers, Scott," he said, "but this fixation isn't healthy. You're scaring the seasonal staff with your stories." "They're not stories," I insisted, but without the conviction I once had. Even to my own ears, the experiences sounded increasingly unbelievable. "I'm giving you a choice," Matthew continued. "Take a transfer to another park, get a fresh start, or stay here. But drop this, whatever it is. No more unauthorized expeditions. No more questioning hikers about strange sightings." I considered it briefly, but in my heart I already knew the answer. "I'll stay," I said. "This is my home." Matthew nodded, seemingly relieved. "Good. The backcountry needs someone who knows it like you do." That conversation marked a turning point. I stopped actively searching for Ketty, or whatever name best fit the entity I'd encountered. Instead, I returned to my ranger duties with renewed focus. The years passed. New rangers came and went. The forest continued its cycles of growth, death, and rebirth. But I changed my practices. I became more deliberate about which trails I recommended to visitors, steering most toward the well-traveled paths. I developed a sixth sense about which hikers would respect the backcountry and which would not, and adjusted my guidance accordingly. When reports came in of strange noises or unusual findings in certain areas, I volunteered to investigate personally. Sometimes, in those remote regions, I would feel it again, that sensation of being watched, evaluated. Occasionally, I would leave small offerings, not animal remains, but arrangements of forest objects, interesting stones, fallen feathers, arrangements of twigs, acknowledgments between old acquaintances. 5 years after my encounter, a search and rescue operation brought me to the edges of what I now thought of as Keddy's territory. A family of 4 had ventured off trail, ignoring warnings, and hadn't returned to their campsite. Night was falling as our team prepared to continue the search into darkness. "We should split up," suggested a younger ranger named Miguel. "Cover more ground." "No," I said firmly. "Not out here. Not at night." "There's a child missing," he argued. "Every minute counts. Together. Or not at all," I insisted, my tone leaving no room for debate. "Trust me on this." Something in my expression must have convinced them. We continued as a group, following the family's likely path deeper into the unmarked wilderness. As we approached the boundary of what I considered protected territory, the forest grew unnaturally quiet. I stopped, signaling the others to do the same. "Wait here," I said softly. "Give me 10 minutes." Before they could protest, I moved forward alone, just beyond earshot of my team. There, I spoke quietly to the darkness. "I know you're watching," I said. "There's a lost family out here. Parents, 2 young children. They meant no disrespect. They're just lost and scared. Please, if they're in your territory, guide them out, or guide us to them." Nothing happened immediately. I waited, patient, listening to the night sounds slowly return around me. Then a soft glow caught my attention. Bioluminescent fungi suddenly illuminated a nearby tree. Then another, farther on, creating a faint path through the darkness. I returned to my team. "This way," I said confidently, following the glowing trail that I suspected only I could see. Within an hour, we found the family, huddled beneath a fallen log, cold and frightened, but unharmed. The father claimed they had been walking in circles for hours until they heard whispers in the wind directing them to shelter. The mother described feeling watched, but not threatened. Guided, even. As we led them back to safety, I felt that familiar presence one last time, acknowledging our departure from its domain. No one else seemed to notice the way the branches parted slightly to ease our passage, or how the night seemed less dark along our chosen path. Back at the ranger station, as I completed the paperwork for the successful rescue, Matthew approached me. "Good work out there," he said. "Miguel tells me you had some kind of sixth sense about where to look." I shrugged. "Just experience." Matthew studied me for a long moment. "Maybe there are things in these woods I don't understand," he admitted quietly. "Things you've accepted that I haven't." "The forest keeps its secrets," I replied, echoing the words of the Quaalude elder from years ago. "Some of them are worth protecting." From that night on, I came to see my role differently. I wasn't just a park ranger protecting the wilderness from people. I was also protecting people from aspects of the wilderness they weren't prepared to encounter. I became a guardian of boundaries. Human boundaries, natural boundaries, and the mysterious spaces in between. It's been years since that day, and I still don't know exactly what we saw. Daniel moved to Arizona, about as far from the rainforest as you can get. We exchanged holiday cards, but never discuss what happened. Matthew retired, passing the chief ranger position to someone younger, someone who never knew about the incident at Cow Creek. Sometimes when I'm out there alone, I still feel it, that prickle on the back of my neck, that sense that something's watching, waiting. I don't fear it anymore. We've reached an understanding, the Guardian and I. We share the same purpose to preserve something ancient and mysterious, something beyond human comprehension. The only joke I could make after all that? Well, next time someone asks if I'm bringing my gun, my answer is simple. I'm not making that mistake twice. But the truth is, I don't think I'll ever need it. Not against what lives in the deepest parts of Olympic National Park. Those who respect the forest have nothing to fear from its guardian. Those who don't, well, they might just find themselves in a clearing that doesn't exist, surrounded by bones left as warnings to others. The forest remembers. The forest watches. And sometimes, if you're very quiet and very lucky, or perhaps very unlucky, you might just catch a glimpse of the one who watches with it. 15 years have passed since my first encounter with Ketty. I'm in my 50s now, with more gray in my beard than brown, and knees that protest on rainy mornings. The younger rangers call me Old Man Scott behind my back. I don't mind. There's respect in the nickname that they don't even realize. I've never told my full story to anyone, except one person. Lisa Chin, who became chief ranger after Matthew retired. She needed to know what she was inheriting, not just a park, but a relationship with something ancient and powerful that called these woods home long before humans arrived. "Do you think there's more than one?" she asked me once, as we hiked near the boundaries of what I still considered Ketty's territory. "Maybe," I replied, "or maybe it's something that can be in many places at once. I don't think our understanding of individual beings applies to it." Unlike Matthew, Lisa never doubted me. She'd grown up with her Chinese grandmother's stories of forest spirits and guardian entities. "Different cultures, same truths," she said. "Some things exist whether we have the right words for them or not." Together, we developed unofficial protocols for dealing with the areas where the boundaries felt thinnest. Nothing on paper, such things couldn't be documented in government reports, but understood among the senior staff. Certain trails were monitored more closely. Certain visitor reports were routed directly to me or Lisa. Certain areas were subtly discouraged for casual hikers through selective maintenance and minimal signage. Last spring, a university research team requested permits to conduct an extensive biological survey in the Cow Creek region. Their proposal included motion-activated cameras, soil samples, and extended campouts in precisely the areas I'd learned to treat with caution. "We have to approve it," Lisa said reluctantly. "They've got backing from the Department of the Interior. But you should join them." "As what, a babysitter?" I asked, though I already knew she was right. "As a guide," she corrected. "Someone who knows the terrain." The research team arrived in early May, 4 graduate students led by an ecology professor with a reputation for groundbreaking work on forest ecosystems. Dr. Eliza Harding was younger than I expected, mid-40s, with intelligent eyes and hands calloused from fieldwork. "Ranger Scott," she said when we met, her handshake firm. "Your reputation precedes you. They say you know this forest better than anyone." "Parts of it," I admitted. "Other parts don't want to be known." She smiled, taking my comment as poetic license rather than literal truth. "Well, we're here to change that. Our imaging technology can map root systems throughout entire acres of forest. If there are secrets here, we'll find them." Something in her confidence unsettled me, not arrogance, but the certainty of someone who believed that everything in nature could be categorized, measured, explained. I'd once believed the same. The first week passed uneventfully. We established a base camp well outside the boundaries I mentally maintained, and the team conducted their preliminary research in the safer areas. Dr. Harding was thorough, professional, and genuinely passionate about forest conservation. Under different circumstances, I might have appreciated her work more. It was one of the graduate students, Marcus, who first noticed something odd about their equipment. "The cameras keep malfunctioning," he complained one evening around the campfire. "Perfect conditions, fresh batteries, but the memory cards come back corrupted." Only in certain locations, added another student, Jen. The western quadrants are fine, but anything we set up to the east just fails. Dr. Harding frowned. Electronic equipment can be finicky in high humidity environments. We'll recalibrate tomorrow, I said. I said nothing, but I knew which direction lay east of our camp, the heart of Ketty's territory. The next day, as the team prepared to move deeper into the problematic area, I pulled Dr. Harding aside. I think we should stick to the western quadrants, I suggested. The eastern section has some unstable ground, flash flood risk. She studied my face. That's not in any of the geological surveys. Not everything makes it into reports, I said carefully. Ranger Scott, she said, her voice lowered. Is there something you're not telling me about this area? I hesitated, weighing decades of experience against the certainty of sounding like a superstitious fool. This forest has sensitive areas, places that react poorly to intrusion. To my surprise, she didn't immediately dismiss me. Indigenous sacred sites? I should have been informed if we're crossing cultural boundaries. Not exactly, I said. It's more complicated than that. Then explain it to me, she challenged. I'm a scientist, Ranger. I deal in evidence and observation. So I told her, not everything, but enough. The encounter with the creature, the moving clearings, the strange phenomena that defied explanation. I expected skepticism or even mockery, but instead she listened intently. You realize what you're describing breaks several laws of physics, she said when I finished. I know what I've seen, I replied simply. She was quiet for a long moment. I've spent 20 years studying forest ecosystems, she finally said, and there are phenomena we still can't explain. Mycorrhizal networks that communicate in ways we're just beginning to understand. Trees that share resources across species boundaries when it defies evolutionary self-interest. She picked up a handful of soil, letting it filter through her fingers. The more we learn, the more we realize we don't know. So you believe me? I asked, surprised. I believe you experienced something significant, she said carefully. Whether it's what you think it is, that's what we're here to find out, isn't it? That afternoon, we compromised. The team would continue their research, but would approach the Eastern Territories with modified protocols. Smaller groups, less invasive equipment, ritualized requests for permission spoken aloud before entering new areas. Dr. Harding called it an anthropological approach to ecological research. I called it common sense. For 3 days, it seemed to work. The equipment functioned, though the readings were often unusual. Temperature fluctuations that shouldn't have been possible, soil compositions that didn't match previous samples taken mere feet away. The forest seemed to be cooperating, if reluctantly. Then Marcus disappeared. He'd gone to check a remote sensor station alone, against protocols. When he didn't return by nightfall, we initiated search procedures. The area where he'd last been seen was at the very edge of what I considered safe territory. As darkness fell, I felt that familiar prickle on my neck. We were being watched. We need to find him tonight, I told Dr. Harding. Not tomorrow, tonight. She didn't argue, sensing the urgency in my voice. We formed 3 search teams, each with emergency supplies and powerful lights. I led the team heading directly toward the boundary where I suspected Marcus had crossed. 2 hours into the search, our radios began to malfunction. Static at first, then bizarre sounds, what seemed like whispers just below the threshold of understanding. My team members exchanged nervous glances. Stay close, I ordered. No matter what happens, stay together. We found Marcus's equipment first, his backpack neatly placed at the base of a massive Douglas fir, nothing missing or damaged. Then, 50 yards away, his notebook, open to a page filled with frantic sketches of symbols that looked disturbingly like those I'd seen carved into trees years ago. But no Marcus. As midnight approached, a fog rolled in, unnaturally thick and localized. It swirled around us, forming patterns that seemed almost deliberate. The other teams reported similar conditions in their areas. It's testing us, I murmured to myself. Then, through the fog, I saw it. Not the creature itself, but a path forming as the mist parted. I'd been here before, years ago, during that family rescue. A message, an offering. This way, I called to my team. And whatever you do, show respect. The path led us to a clearing that hadn't been there during our daytime mapping. A perfect circle of bare earth surrounded by impossibly dense vegetation. In the center lay Marcus, unconscious but breathing, arranged in what could only be described as a ceremonial position, arms crossed over his chest, surrounded by a circle of those strange fungi that glowed with bioluminescence. As we approached, the air grew heavy, charged, like the moment before lightning strikes. I stopped my team with a raised hand and stepped forward alone. "We've come for him," I said to the darkness. "We mean no disrespect. We'll leave your territory and take our research elsewhere." The silence that followed felt evaluating, considering. Then a response, not in words, but in sensation. Permission granted, but conditioned. I understood somehow that this was both warning and gift. We carried Marcus back to camp. He woke the next morning with no memory of what had happened after he discovered a strange hollow tree that wasn't on any of our maps. The only evidence of his experience was a small, perfect spiral pattern etched into the skin over his heart. Not a cut or burn, but what looked like a birthmark that hadn't been there before. Dr. Harding made the decision to terminate the research project early. "The data we've collected is problematic," she told her disappointed team. "Inconsistent in ways that challenge our methodology. We need to reassess before continuing." Later, as they packed their equipment, she sought me out. "What really happened out there? Ranger Scott?" "The forest made its boundaries clear," I said simply. She nodded slowly. "I'm going to continue my research, but differently, with more awareness of the limitations of our understanding." She hesitated. "Would you consider collaborating on a paper, not about what happened here specifically, but about alternative approaches to ecological research in sensitive areas?" That paper, published 2 years ago under our joint authorship, never mentioned Ket or anything supernatural. Instead, it proposed protocols for minimally invasive research methodologies, respecting both known and unknown ecological sensitivities. It became required reading for graduate students in several university forestry programs. I'm retiring next year. Lisa wants me to stay on as a consultant, and I probably will. Some connections can't be broken by paperwork or pension plans. The forest and I have an understanding that transcends my official role. Sometimes, when I'm alone on patrol in the deep woods, I speak aloud to Ket. I don't know if what we have is friendship. Such a human concept seems inadequate for an entity so ancient, but there is recognition, respect, a mutual guardianship of something precious. The younger rangers have started to notice how wildlife behaves differently around me, how storms seem to skirt my patrol routes, how lost hikers are found more quickly when I lead the search. They joke that I'm a forest whisperer. They don't know how close to the truth they are. As for Marcus, he never returned to Olympic National Park, but he changed his dissertation focus to indigenous forest management practices and now works with tribal authorities throughout the Pacific Northwest. The spiral mark on his chest never faded. Sometimes he sends me field notes with observations about sensitive areas in other old-growth forests. I keep them in a locked drawer along with my own private journals. The forest keeps its secrets, but it also chooses its confidants. I've made my peace with being one of them. My name's Sophia Red Hawk. I'm Meskwaki, and back in 1987, I took a job clearing trails up near Jasper National Park in Alberta. I figured I'd spend a few months earning a paycheck while enjoying the mountains. I've always liked a good challenge, and I don't mind being alone. For the most part, it was just me, a beat-up truck, and a couple of worn-out boots. The land there felt untouched. The vast stretches of wilderness made me feel like the first man ever to set foot there. I'll admit I expected the usual fare: bears, maybe a mountain lion if I was lucky, and the occasional tricky bit of terrain. Not that I'm a stranger to danger. Growing up, I spent enough time in the woods to know how to keep my wits about me. But nothing prepared me for what happened on that one brutal afternoon. The park superintendent, a grizzled man named Jeremiah, hired me with barely a glance at my resume. "Not many want to work this far out," he said, passing me a thermos of coffee strong enough to dissolve metal. "Last guy quit after 2 weeks. Said the place gave him nightmares." I laughed it off. Every wilderness job comes with its share of ghost stories and superstitions. My first week was uneventful. Crushing work that left my muscles screaming, but the good kind of pain that comes with honest labor. The mountains loomed around me, ancient and indifferent. At night in my small cabin, I'd hear sounds that city folks would find unsettling: the distant howl of wolves, the occasional scream of a mountain lion that sounds eerily human. But to me, it was just the natural symphony of the wild. Then I met Carlos and Timothy, 2 locals assigned to work with me on a particularly overgrown section of trail. Carlos was tall and weathered, with a face like sun-baked leather and eyes that seemed to see right through you. Timothy was younger, twitchy, with quick movements and a nervous laugh. Both had lived their entire lives in the shadow of these mountains. "You settling in all right?" Carlos asked one morning as we loaded equipment into my truck. His tone was casual, but something in his gaze made me feel like he was asking more than a simple question. "Just fine," I replied. "Though the nights get pretty quiet out here," Timothy snorted. "Quiet? You're lucky. Some nights I can barely sleep with all the noises." Carlos shot him a look that silenced him immediately. "Don't mind Tim," Carlos said, his voice flat. "Boy's got an overactive imagination. These woods are just woods, long as you respect them." That night at our first campfire, after a day of clearing deadfall and marking trail paths, Carlos's demeanor changed. As the flames cast long shadows through the trees, he began telling stories, local legends passed down through generations about these mountains. The Cree and Stony people called these peaks the Forbidden Hills before white men came, he said, poking at the fire. Said they were home to spirits that didn't take kindly to trespassers. The early trappers and surveyors had stories too. Men disappearing, strange sounds in the night, tracks that didn't match any known animal. Timothy nodded enthusiastically. "My grandfather used to say there's something in these woods that's been here longer than people. Something that watches, waits." Carlos, with his deadpan delivery, turned to me. "Sophia, if you see something out there that don't feel right, just act like you're part of the scenery." Timothy laughed, but I noticed the way his eyes darted off like he was remembering something. I brushed it off as another one of their pranks, though in hindsight, I should have paid attention. That night, in my sleeping bag, I woke to the sound of something moving outside our tent. Heavy footsteps circling slowly. I lay perfectly still, listening as they approached, then receded, only to come back again. The pattern continued for nearly an hour before fading into the distance. "Just a curious bear," Carlos said the next morning when I mentioned it. But he wouldn't meet my eyes, and Timothy kept glancing nervously at the tree line as we packed up. As we moved deeper into the park over the next few days, I noticed changes in the atmosphere. The usual forest sounds, birds, insects, small mammals, would suddenly cease, leaving an unnatural silence that pressed against my eardrums. Sometimes I'd catch glimpses of movement at the corner of my vision, only to turn and find nothing there. "The forest has eyes," Timothy whispered one evening. Carlos cuffed him lightly on the head, but his usual stoic expression had begun to crack, revealing something I hadn't seen in him before: fear. Our 5th day out began with an oppressive fog that rolled in overnight, transforming the familiar landscape into something alien. Trees loomed like sentinels, their outlines blurred and distorted in the thick mist. The usual morning chorus of birds was notably absent. Bad hunting weather, Carlos muttered as we broke camp, his breath forming clouds in the chill air. But I noticed his eyes scanning the fog with unusual intensity. Timothy was uncharacteristically quiet, his normal nervous energy replaced by a rigid alertness. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "We should stick to the main trails today." Carlos nodded curtly. "Just marking the path to Blackwater Ridge. Simple job. We'll be back before dark." The fog muffled our footsteps as we hiked, creating the unsettling sensation that we were moving through a dreamscape. Our voices seemed to die inches from our mouths, absorbed by the thick air. Even the solid thunk of my axe against wood felt distant, disconnected. By midday, the fog had begun to thin, but the forest remained eerily silent. We were making good progress, hacking away at thick branches and laying down markers when we spotted a massive tree up ahead, uprooted and lying across the trail. "Damn, that thing's huge," Timothy muttered, pulling his cap down. We figured we'd clear it enough to get past, but as we got closer, something felt off. The ground around the tree was littered with torn-up soil and half-buried bones. At first, I thought they were animal bones, but then I saw one that looked unsettlingly human. A femur, partially buried under a tangle of roots. Carlos muttered something under his breath, bending down for a closer look. He poked at it with his axe handle, then looked up at us, his face a shade paler. "No way those bones got here by accident. Somebody put them here," he said, his voice low. "All right, joke's over," I said, trying to shrug it off, but my voice sounded shaky even to me. When I looked back down, the realization hit hard. The bones weren't just lying there, they'd been arranged in a circle. It was deliberate, like some twisted ritual. A shiver crawled up my spine, and I wasn't the only one. Timothy stepped back, crossing himself. "I've heard about this," he whispered. "Old man Guy used to talk about finding circles in the woods, said they were doorways for it to come through." "Shut up, Tim," Carlos snapped, but there was no bite to his words, just fear. I knelt to examine the bones more closely. Some were old, bleached white by sun and rain, but others had an unsettling freshness to them, and they weren't all animal. I was certain now. Among them were unmistakably human remains, a jawbone with teeth still intact, finger bones arranged in a disturbing pattern, and what appeared to be part of a child's skull. "We need to report this," I said, fighting to keep my voice steady. "This is a crime scene." Carlos's laugh was hollow. "Police won't come up here. They never do. Last time something like this was found, the ranger who reported it was told to forget about it, said it was probably just animal remains and kids playing pranks." "These aren't pranks," Timothy insisted, his voice cracking. He was staring at the bones with a kind of horrified recognition. "My grandfather said the Skitka marks its territory this way, takes from the prey it's killed." "There's no such thing as the damn Skitka," Carlos hissed, but his hand trembled as he adjusted his pack. I stood up, brushing dirt from my hands. "Let's just mark this location and head back. Whatever this is, it's not our problem." We agreed to keep moving, making a silent pact not to talk about it. We veered off our planned route, walking in a straight line to put as much distance between us and that bone circle as possible. But an unspoken tension had settled over us, and I found myself scanning the trees with new wariness. As we hiked, I noticed Timothy whispering to himself, occasionally making quick gestures across his chest. Carlos had gone completely silent, his usual stoic demeanor replaced by something that looked like resignation. The afternoon wore on, and clouds gathered overhead, dimming the already filtered light. The temperature dropped noticeably, and the wind picked up, carrying with it a sour, rotten odor that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You smell that?" I asked, pausing to sniff the air. Carlos nodded grimly. "Something died nearby?" "Or something's hunting," Timothy whispered. We pushed on, but the smell grew stronger, making my eyes water and my stomach churn. Then, as we rounded a bend in the newly cleared trail, we saw them, claw marks, deep, vicious gouges in the trunks of several trees, too high for a bear and too wide for any cougar I'd ever encountered. Some were fresh, the exposed wood still oozing sap. Others were older, scabbed over with bark trying to heal, but all of them formed the same pattern. 3 parallel slashes, each as wide as my thumb. "Those are warnings," Timothy said, his voice barely audible. "It's telling us we're in its territory now." Carlos's hand moved to the hunting knife at his belt, a reflexive gesture that did nothing to ease the growing knot of dread in my gut. As daylight began to fade, we made camp in a small clearing, none of us willing to admit we were too scared to continue in the dark. We built the fire larger than necessary, forming a circle of light against the encroaching shadows. That night, none of us slept. We sat around the fire, listening to the forest sounds that had returned with nightfall. Only now, they seemed to carry sinister undertones. Every snap of a twig made Timothy flinch. Every distant howl caused Carlos to tighten his grip on his knife. And somewhere in the darkness beyond our firelight, something watched. I could feel its gaze like a physical weight, patient and hungry and ancient. I knew then that we had crossed a boundary. We had entered something's domain, and it knew we were there. Dawn arrived with a disorienting blanket of fog, thicker than the day before. It clung to the trees like ghostly shrouds, reducing visibility to mere feet and transforming familiar shapes into looming specters. We packed in silence, the events of the previous day hanging over us like the mist itself. "We should head back to the ranger station," I suggested, fighting to keep my voice casual. "Report what we found yesterday." Carlos shook his head. "Trailbacks washed out from the rain 2 nights ago. We'd need to circle around, add another day at least. Best to push through to Harrow Creek Outpost. It's closer and they've got radio equipment." "If we get there," Timothy muttered, his eyes darting nervously to the impenetrable wall of fog surrounding us. The atmosphere between us had shifted fundamentally. Gone was the easy camaraderie of fellow laborers, replaced by a wary vigilance. We moved in tight formation, Carlos taking point, me in the middle, and Timothy watching our backs. The usual banter was absent, replaced by terse instructions and the occasional whispered warning. An hour in, we stumbled on more bones, some charred and scattered around in the shape of another circle, only larger this time. And then that awful smell hit us, an overwhelming stench of decay, like something rotting in the summer heat. It was coming from somewhere just beyond the next tree line. We knew better than to ignore it. The smell wasn't normal, and with 2 circles of bones already, none of us could pretend it was just nature. We crept forward cautiously, trying to breathe through our shirts, and found the source. A deer carcass, ripped apart, lying in another ring of disturbed dirt. But this was no regular kill. The cuts on the animal weren't like anything I'd ever seen before, not from any predator I knew. Deep, jagged slashes ran down its side as if it had been ripped open by something with claws thick as railroad spikes. Timothy was the first to speak. "That's no bear. I've hunted bears all my life, and they don't leave a mess like this." Carlos nodded, but he stayed quiet. His face was smacks, unreadable, but I could tell he was rattled. What struck me most wasn't just the violence of the kill, but its deliberate nature. The deer had been eviscerated with surgical precision, its organs removed and arranged in small piles around the perimeter of the circle. Its head had been twisted completely backward, antlers driven into the ground like makeshift stakes. Most disturbing of all, carved into the flesh of its exposed flank were 3 distinct symbols that resembled no language I recognized. Curved, angular markings that seemed to writhe and shift if you looked at them too long. "We need to get out of here," I said, backing away from the grisly scene. "Whatever did this isn't natural," Timothy finished, his voice a hoarse whisper. "My grandfather said the skitka marks its kills, shows what it can do to those who trespass." Carlos spat on the ground. For Christ's sake, Tim, stop with the Skitka nonsense. This is probably some sicko's work. Maybe those eco-terrorists trying to scare loggers off. But his explanation rang hollow, and I could see in his eyes that he didn't believe it himself. We decided it was best to head back, report the find, and leave it to the park authorities. But the forest felt different on the way back. Every shadow seemed longer, and the fog had thickened again, muffling our voices. We trudged on, barely speaking, each of us lost in our own thoughts, keeping an eye on the underbrush. A few hours in, we realized we'd lost our bearings. Somehow, we were walking in circles. No matter how we tried to reorient ourselves, the landmarks were all wrong. Trees we'd marked were nowhere to be found. The compass didn't seem to work, spinning wildly, and the radio was dead. Panic crept in, and I tried to keep it at bay, but even Carlos looked scared. Then we heard it, a slow, steady scratching sound, like something scraping against bark. We froze, listening as the noise grew louder, coming from somewhere up ahead, obscured by the dense fog. The scratching stopped, and then there was silence, thick and oppressive. "It's marking its territory again," Timothy whispered. I didn't answer, because in that silence I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. A chill deep in my bones. A sense that we weren't alone. We weren't the hunters here. We were the hunted. As the day wore on, the sun never fully broke through the clouds, creating an endless twilight that played tricks on the mind. Shadows seemed to move independently of their sources. The wind carried whispers that sounded almost like words, in a language too ancient to understand. We found ourselves in a part of the forest none of us recognized. Older, wilder. With trees so massive, they must have been ancient when the first Europeans arrived. Moss hung from branches like tattered curtains, and the ground was soft and yielding beneath our feet, as if the earth itself had begun to rot. "This isn't right," Carlos said, breaking hours of silence. "These trees aren't native to this region. We shouldn't be seeing redwoods this far north." "We're lost," I said, stating the obvious but needing to hear it spoken aloud. Timothy shook his head. "Not lost. Led." I was about to dismiss his superstition when I noticed something that stopped me cold. Embedded in the trunk of the nearest tree was a small yellowed object, a human tooth. As my eyes adjusted, I realized with growing horror that there were more. Dozens of them, pressed into the bark of every tree around us like grotesque ornaments. "Jesus Christ," Carlos whispered, his hardened exterior finally cracking. "What the hell is this place?" That's when we heard it. A sound like wet leather being stretched and torn, followed by a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere at once. No animal I knew made a sound like that. Part roar, part human moan. All wrong. The temperature plummeted, our breath suddenly visible in the air despite the summer season. The very atmosphere felt charged, like the moment before lightning strikes. I knew then that we weren't getting out. At least, not all of us. Whatever had brought us here, whatever had been stalking us through the wilderness, was done playing games. As darkness began to fall in earnest, we huddled together, back to back, weapons drawn. Though what good an axe or a knife would do against the thing that had made that sound, I couldn't say. We were beyond fear now in that strange, calm place where the mind accepts that death is imminent and can only hope it comes quickly. The smell came first, that same rotting stench, but stronger now, overwhelming. Then came the sound of something large moving through the underbrush, circling our position with deliberate, unhurried steps. "Don't run," Carlos whispered, his voice steadier than I expected. "Whatever you do, don't run. That's what it wants." Timothy was trembling violently, his knife clutched in a white-knuckled grip. "It's here," he whimpered. "God help us. The Skitka is here." We pressed forward cautiously until we came to a clearing where the trees opened up to a stretch of land covered in deep grooves, fresh and raw, like some giant creature had clawed its way through. The sight was enough to send any rational person running. But before we could react, we saw movement from the edge of the clearing. A hulking figure slinked through the mist, almost blending in with the fog, with a gait that wasn't quite right, not human, but not animal either. Its body was covered in a patchwork of matted fur, long and ragged, and it moved with an eerie, unhurried confidence. Carlos raised his hand to signal us to stay still, but it was too late. Timothy, who'd been on edge since we found that first circle, snapped. He let out a strangled yell and turned to run. He barely made it a few feet before the creature moved, faster than anything I'd ever seen. 1 second, it was at the edge of the clearing. The next, it was on him, a blur of claws and teeth. I barely had time to process what was happening. Carlos and I stood there, frozen in horror, as the thing ripped into Timothy. The sounds, bone-snapping, flesh-tearing, were sickening. And then, just as quickly as it had attacked, it stopped and looked up. Its face, a twisted mess of scars and sharp angles, with a mouth too wide, filled with rows of uneven teeth. It dropped Timothy, who was beyond saving by then, and turned its gaze on us. I felt every instinct in my body scream to run, but I knew we wouldn't make it far. Carlos, being the braver of the two of us, took a step forward, raising his axe defensively. "Don't look it in the eyes," he whispered to me, his voice remarkably steady. "Back away slowly." The creature tilted its head, studying us with an intelligence that was more terrifying than any mindless aggression would have been. It stood upright now, towering at least 8 feet tall, its proportions all wrong, arms too long, joints bending in impossible directions. Its skin, where visible through the matted fur, was a mottled gray-green color, like the flesh of a corpse left too long in water. But it was the eyes that haunted me most. Milky white orbs without pupils, yet somehow conveying an ancient, calculating malevolence. Those eyes held knowledge, memories of countless hunts, of prey that had stood exactly where we stood now. "Listen to me," Carlos said, his voice low and even. "I'm going to distract it. When I do, you run. Don't look back. Don't stop for anything. Head due east and don't stop until you hit the service road." "Carlos, no." I started to protest, but he cut me off. My grandfather faced one of these things back in '32. He said, eyes never leaving the creature as it watched us with predatory patience. There's a rhythm to it, a ritual. It needs to be respected. With deliberate slowness, Carlos reached into his pocket and pulled out a small leather pouch. He tossed it toward the creature, where it landed with a soft thud at its misshapen feet. "We acknowledge your dominion," Carlos called out, his voice carrying an authority I hadn't heard before. "We offer tribute and seek passage." For a moment, nothing happened. The creature remained motionless, its breathing a wet, ragged sound in the silence. Then, with a movement almost too fast to track, it snatched up the pouch and tore it open. Inside were small, gleaming objects. I realized with a shock that they were teeth, human teeth. "My family has hunted these woods for generations," Carlos said quietly. Not to the creature, but to me. "We've always known what lives here, always paid the price for passage." The creature examined the contents of the pouch, turning the teeth over in its massive clawed hands with an almost tender care. Then it raised its head and made a sound, not a roar or growl, but a series of clicks and whistles that seemed to come from deep within its chest cavity. "Go," Carlos hissed at me. "Now, while it's distracted." But there was no time for a heroic stand. The creature lunged at him, and I didn't look back. I ran, my mind blank with terror, but crashing through the underbrush, barely able to keep my balance. Carlos's scream followed me, a sound of such pure agony that it cut through my panic like a knife. It rose to an impossible pitch before ending in a wet gurgle that told me everything I needed to know about his fate. I ran blindly, branches whipping my face, roots threatening to trip me with every step. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like they would collapse beneath me. But terror kept me moving long past the point of exhaustion. Behind me, I heard it coming. Not the crash of pursuit through undergrowth, but a swift, silent movement that was somehow more terrifying. It was toying with me, I realized. It could have caught me at any time, but it was enjoying the chase, savoring my fear like a fine wine. Somewhere in my flight, I lost my axe, my pack, even one of my boots torn off when I stumbled through a patch of brambles. None of it mattered. All that existed was the desperate need to escape, to put distance between myself and the thing that hunted me. Night was falling rapidly now. The forest grew darker with each passing minute. I had no idea if I was heading east as Carlos had instructed, or simply running in circles. My only thought was to keep moving, to somehow find my way back to civilization, to lights and people, and the comfort of human voices. Then I made a fatal mistake. I looked back. It was there, just yards behind me, moving with that strange, loping gait that ate up distance without seeming to hurry. Its eyes gleamed in the fading light, fixed on me with the certainty of a predator that knows its prey is tiring. My foot caught a root and I went down hard, the impact knocking what little breath I had left from my lungs. I scrambled to get up, but my body betrayed me, muscles seizing with exhaustion and fear. This was it, I thought. This was how I would end, torn apart in the wilderness, another mysterious disappearance, another set of bones arranged in a ritual circle. The creature slowed its approach, savoring the moment. It made that clicking sound again, almost like laughter. I could smell its rancid breath, see the remains of Timothy and possibly Carlos caught in its jagged teeth. With the last of my strength, I pulled myself to my knees and faced it. If I was going to die, I wouldn't do it curled in a ball of terror. The creature towered over me, blocking out what little light remained in the sky. It reached down with one massive clawed hand, and I closed my eyes, waiting for the killing blow. Instead, I felt something drop into my lap, small, hard objects that clinked together. I opened my eyes and looked down to see what it had given me. Teeth. Human teeth, worn and yellowed with age. Among them, I recognized newer ones. Carlos's gold molar and what must have been one of Timothy's fillings. When I looked up again, the creature was gone, vanished into the gathering darkness as if it had never been there at all. I don't remember how long I ran. Hours, maybe. The sun was setting by the time I finally collapsed near a dirt road, panting and bleeding from cuts and bruises I hadn't noticed in my panic. I lay there for what felt like an eternity, listening, half expecting that thing to come tearing through the woods after me. I finally dragged myself to my feet and stumbled along the road until I spotted a ranger's vehicle. They didn't believe me at first, said it was probably a bear, maybe a rogue cougar. But when they sent a team out to where I said it happened, they came back empty-handed. No bodies. No clearing with claw marks, no bones arranged in rings. The park rangers found my truck where we'd left it, with all our camping gear untouched. Carlos and Timothy's personal effects were still in their backpacks, wallets, keys, cigarettes, as if they'd simply stepped away for a moment and would return any second. The search lasted 2 weeks before the authorities officially classified them as missing, presumed dead from an animal attack or exposure. I spent 3 days in the regional hospital, treated for dehydration, multiple lacerations, and what the doctor diplomatically called acute stress reaction. The physical wounds healed quickly enough, but the nightmares persisted. In them, I was always running through endless woods while that clicking, whistling sound followed close behind. When I was released, I drove straight to the local library and immersed myself in research, desperate for some explanation, some context for what I'd experienced. I didn't expect to find anything concrete about the creature itself. What wildlife biologist would document something like that? But I hoped to uncover some historical pattern, some local folklore that might make sense of it all. I did some digging afterward, trying to figure out what it was that had attacked us. I couldn't find anything concrete, but there were whispers. Stories from the old-timers about a creature they called the Skitka, a spirit of the land that protected its territory by any means necessary. They described it as part bear, part wolf, with a soul twisted by rage. They told me that anyone who saw it rarely lived to tell the tale. An elderly librarian noticed my research and invited me to her home for tea. Her grandfather had been a guide for the first European surveyors of the region in the late 1800s. She shared yellow journal entries describing a territory where the laws of man and nature both fail, where something ancient watches from the shadows. The surveyors had lost 3 men in a single night. Their remains found arranged in a circle, organs removed, teeth missing. The indigenous peoples of the region had their own stories, legends of a being that had existed before humans, that had watched the first people arrive and had been watching ever since. They called it by different names, but the descriptions were consistent: a guardian of sacred places that punished those who disturbed the natural order. Most disturbing was what the old woman told me about Carlos's family. They had lived in the region for generations, serving as guides and trackers. They were known for their ability to navigate the deepest, most treacherous parts of the wilderness and return unscathed. Local rumors suggested they had made some kind of pact with the forest, an arrangement sealed in blood and teeth. "They pay the tribute," she whispered, her rheumy eyes fixed on mine. "Every generation, they offer what is required, and in return, they are granted safe passage." I thought of Carlos's leather pouch, the casual way he had tossed it toward the creature, the ritualistic precision of his words. He had known all along. He had known what we might encounter, and he had come prepared to negotiate with it. Except this time, his tribute hadn't been enough. As for Carlos and Timothy, they were listed as missing. Their families held memorial services, but without bodies, there was never any real closure. I attended both, standing at the back, unable to look their loved ones in the eye. What could I tell them? That their sons, husbands, fathers had been sacrificed to something that shouldn't exist? That Carlos had tried to appease it with a pouch of teeth and Timothy had been torn apart while I watched? I left Alberta as soon as I was physically able. Drove straight through to Montana without stopping except for gas. I wanted distance, borders, mountain ranges between me and what had happened in those woods. But distance doesn't matter to nightmares. In the years since, I've encountered others who've had similar experiences in remote wilderness areas across North America. Hikers, rangers, loggers, all with stories of bone circles, of missing time, of creatures glimpsed moving just at the edge of perception. Most are too afraid to speak openly about what they saw, fearing ridicule or worse. We recognize each other, though. There's a look in the eyes that gives us away, a weariness that never quite fades. Sometimes I wonder why I was spared. Was it Carlos's sacrifice that purchased my freedom? Or did the creature choose to let me go, to carry its story back to the world of men? Some nights when I wake gasping from dreams of endless pursuit, I wonder if I escaped at all. I keep the teeth it gave me in a small wooden box on my nightstand. I've never shown them to anyone else. Sometimes, when I'm alone in the dark and the wind sounds too much like that whistling, clicking language, I open the box and touch them, reminding myself that it was real. That somewhere in the vast wilderness of Jasper National Park, something ancient and terrible continues its endless patrol. And sometimes, when I catch a familiar scent on the wind, that rotting, earthy smell, or when I see unusual scratch marks on trees near my cabin, I wonder if my story isn't over yet. If perhaps the Skitka has followed me, watching from the shadows of a new territory, waiting for me to venture too far from safety. Because the one thing all the stories agree on is this: once the Skitka has marked you as its own, it never truly lets you go. Way back in 2012, I first saw that photo, the one that changed my life. There she was, a young woman sitting on a bed with the most breathtaking view of pine-dotted mountains behind her. I remember thinking, if that's her home, what do I have to do to live in that kind of coniferous paradise? I did some research and found out that the woman wasn't living there permanently. She was a fire lookout. She stayed up there for months at a time and got paid for it. From that moment, I was obsessed. Living the life of a fire lookout for a summer seemed like the adventure of a lifetime. I thought it would be easy to get into, but I was wrong on both counts. When I first applied in 2012, I was way underqualified and got rejected within days. That stung, but it also ignited a fire in me. I did volunteer work, built up my resume with stints at community gardens, and even spent some time at the National Arboretum. By the time 2015 rolled around, I thought I had a fighting chance. But after weeks of hoping and praying, I got another rejection. This one hurt twice as much. I'd put in the work, but it still wasn't enough. It took 2 more years of grinding, applying, and getting rejected. By the time I applied for the 2018 season, just before the 2017 holidays, I was so jaded that I made alternative plans for the summer. That way, the rejection would be like water off a duck's back. And then the only time I actually planned not to be accepted was the year I finally was. I remember opening the email with shaking hands. When I read the words, "Congratulations, you've been assigned to Gold Mountain Lookout," I felt a mix of disbelief and elation. I'd waited 4 years for this, and it was finally happening. Gold Mountain, the tallest living tower in Washington state, would be my home for the next 3 months. I caught a red-eye from Portland to Spokane, landed in the early morning, and drove 170 miles out to Gold Mountain with my truck rental. The place was surprisingly easy to locate with its own access road, Gold Mountain Lookout Drive. When I arrived mid-morning, a friendly forest ranger met me. We went over a few final details, and he handed me the keys. His big, warm smile and the way he asked if I had any second thoughts made me laugh. I was too excited to back out. Once he left, I was alone. The isolation was both thrilling and daunting. I danced a little jig as I went to retrieve my stuff, feeling on top of the world. The only downsides were having to use a nearby creek to wash myself and walking down to the bottom of the tower to use the chemical toilet, but the pros outweighed the cons by a mile. For the first few days, everything was perfect. I loved the solitude, the peace, and the spectacular views. It was everything I dreamed of. But there was this nagging feeling in the back of my mind. Be careful what you wish for. The nights were the hardest. I didn't scare easily, but the noises in the woods at night were unnerving. The wind howled around the tower, making it creak like an old ship. I told myself it was just the wind, but the fear of something more sinister lingered. Every creak and groan felt like a footstep, every rustle of leaves like a whisper. One night, as I lay in bed with my heart racing, I realized that this dream of mine wasn't going to be all about peace and solitude. There was something out there, something watching, and I wasn't sure if I was ready to face it. The isolation grew on me faster than I expected. Each day was a new adventure, and I quickly fell into a routine. Wake up, check for fires, maintain the equipment, log the weather, and enjoy the vast expanse of wilderness that stretched out before me. It was everything I'd imagined and more. But there was always that gnawing feeling in the pit of my stomach, a sense of unease that I couldn't quite shake. The creek was my lifeline for washing up, and it was about 100 meters from the lookout tower. The first few times, I was apprehensive, constantly looking over my shoulder. It felt like someone or something was watching me, but I convinced myself it was just my nerves getting the better of me. I'd come here for solitude, after all, and I wasn't about to let my imagination ruin it. Then one day, as I made my way down to the creek, I saw him. A man crouched on the opposite side, dressed like a typical hiker but built like a linebacker. He had dark hair and glasses that gave him a nerdy look, but there was something off about him. My first instinct was to turn back, but I forced myself to keep going. After all, he might just be another hiker passing through. "Hey there, nice day for a hike," I said, trying to keep my voice steady as I approached the creek. He looked up, startled, and then stood up slowly. "Yeah, it is," he replied, but his eyes lingered on me longer than I liked. I stepped into the water, pretending to wash my hands, all the while keeping an eye on him. He seemed curious, asking what I was doing out here all alone. "I'm a fire lookout," I explained, trying to sound casual. "I stay up in the tower and monitor for fires." "All by yourself?" he asked, a note of disbelief in his voice. "Yes, but I have a radio and bear mace," I said, holding up the canister as if to prove a point. "I'm perfectly safe." He didn't seem convinced, but he nodded and eventually walked away. I watched him go, a cold knot of fear tightening in my stomach. There was something about his demeanor that unsettled me. I finished washing up quickly and hurried back to the tower. For the next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every rustle in the bushes, every snap of a twig sent my heart racing. I told myself it was just paranoia, but I couldn't help but feel like I wasn't alone. My nights became more restless, each creak of the tower and howl of the wind making it harder to sleep. Then, a week later, I saw him again. I was down at the creek, and there he was, sitting on a rock as if waiting for me. My heart sank. This time, his presence wasn't a coincidence. He was there for me. "Hello again," he said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I was hoping I'd run into you." "What do you want?" I asked, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. "I just think it's dangerous for someone to be out here all alone," he replied, standing up and taking a step toward me. "You should have someone to watch your back." "I don't need anyone to watch my back," I said, stepping away from him. "I'm fine on my own." His smile faded, replaced by a look of frustration. "You're not safe out here, Mary. Anything could happen." The way he said my name sent chills down my spine. I backed away, gripping my bear mace tightly. "Stay away from me," I warned. He didn't listen. Instead, he took another step toward me, his eyes dark with determination. "I'm just trying to help." I didn't wait to see what he would do next. I turned and ran back to the tower, my heart pounding in my chest as I climbed the steps. I glanced back and saw him watching me, his expression unreadable. Back in the safety of the tower, I locked the door and sank to the floor, my hands shaking. The dream of solitude and peace had turned into a nightmare. I wasn't alone out here, and I wasn't safe. A week passed after that second encounter, but I never felt at ease. My once peaceful sanctuary now felt like a prison. Every shadow and rustle outside felt like a potential threat. I tried to focus on my duties, keeping a watchful eye on the horizon for signs of fire, but my mind kept drifting back to Max. His words haunted me. "You're not safe out here, Mary." It was late one night when it happened. The crickets had been singing their usual chorus, and I was beginning to drift off when I heard it. A sound that didn't belong, a footstep on the steel stairs below. My eyes flew open and my heart pounded in my chest. I lay there listening, hoping it was just my imagination. But then I heard it again, the distinct clink of a boot on metal. Someone was climbing the stairs. I scrambled out of my sleeping bag, pulling on my boots and grabbing the bear mace and taser. My breath was coming in shallow gasps, and I tried to steady myself. "I know someone's out there," I called out, my voice trembling but loud. "I've got a gun, and I'm about to call the Rangers." There was a moment of silence, and then I heard his voice. "You're not safe out here, Mary." That same flat, scolding tone. It was Max. Fear surged through me, but I forced myself to stay calm. "If you try to come in here, I'll push you off the tower," I shouted. "Get out of here now." His footsteps continued, slowly, methodically. He was getting closer. I could see his shadow moving up the stairs through the gaps in the floor. My hands shook, but I held the bear mace ready, my thumb on the trigger. When Max's face appeared at the window, illuminated by the faint moonlight, I saw his twisted expression of anger and determination. He didn't say anything this time. He just stared at me, his eyes dark and cold. He reached for the door handle. "Don't you dare!" I screamed, and without hesitation, I sprayed the bear mace directly at his face. He recoiled, howling in pain, but he didn't back down. Instead, he lunged forward, trying to push his way into the cabin. I dodged his grasp, my heart racing. He was strong, and I knew I couldn't let him get his hands on me. I grabbed the taser and jabbed it into his side. He screamed again, a horrible, guttural sound, and fell back against the wall. "Get out!" I shouted, my voice breaking. "Leave me alone." Max staggered, trying to regain his balance. I hit him with the taser again, and he collapsed to the floor, writhing in agony. For a moment, I thought he might pass out, but he managed to drag himself toward the stairs. I followed him, my heart still pounding. I gave him one last blast of bear mace as he descended the stairs, making sure he wouldn't turn back. He stumbled down the steps, cursing and groaning, until he disappeared into the darkness below. I ran back into the cabin, slamming the door shut and locking it. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the radio. I called the Rangers, my voice trembling as I reported the attack. By the time they arrived, Max was long gone. They searched the area but found no sign of him. The Rangers were sympathetic, but their reassurances did little to calm my nerves. The police were called, and they questioned me extensively, but without solid evidence, there wasn't much they could do. Max had vanished into the night, leaving me with nothing but fear and the gnawing dread that he might come back. The once serene and beautiful lookout tower now felt like a fortress under siege, and I was its lone defender, always waiting, always watching, never truly at peace. The days that followed felt like an eternity. Every noise, every movement in the forest below set my nerves on edge. I barely slept. The cricket song, which once lulled me to sleep, now kept me awake. Each chirp felt like a countdown to another terrifying encounter with Max. I kept the bear mace and taser within arm's reach, constantly reminding myself of their presence, a flimsy barrier against the relentless dread. One night, as I sat by the window scanning the dark tree line, I saw a shadow move. My heart leapt into my throat. I grabbed the flashlight and shone it into the darkness, but there was nothing, just the wind rustling through the trees. I tried to calm myself, but my mind was a whirlwind of fear and anxiety. The Rangers were kind, but there was only so much they could do. They patrolled the area more frequently and reassured me that Max had likely moved on, but their words were hollow. I knew better. Max wasn't just a passerby. He was a predator, and I was his prey. I kept my radio close, checking in with the Rangers more often than necessary. They didn't mind. They understood my fear. Each time I pressed the button and heard their voices, a small measure of calm washed over me, but it never lasted long. One particularly cold and windy night, I was jolted awake by a sound I had come to dread, the creak of the stairs. I sat up, my heart pounding in my chest, and listened. The wind howled around the tower, making it difficult to discern any specific noises. I strained my ears, hoping, praying that it was just my imagination. Then I heard it again, a distinct, deliberate footstep on the metal stairs. I grabbed the bear mace and taser, my hands trembling. This time I didn't call out. I waited, my breath shallow, my pulse racing. The footsteps grew louder, closer. I could see a shadow moving up the stairs. As the shadow reached the top of the stairs, I shone my flashlight directly at it, illuminating Max's twisted, furious face. His eyes were bloodshot, his expression one of pure rage. "You're not safe out here, Mary," he hissed, echoing his previous threat. Before he could take another step, I sprayed the bear mace directly into his face. He screamed a guttural, animalistic sound and stumbled back. I didn't wait for him to recover. I jabbed the taser into his side, sending volts of electricity through his body. He convulsed, collapsing onto the stairs. "Get out!" I screamed, my voice raw with fear and anger. Get out and never come back." Max managed to crawl down the stairs, his screams of pain echoing through the night. I watched him go, my heart pounding, my hands shaking. When he was finally out of sight, I ran back into the cabin and locked the door. I called the Rangers, my voice trembling as I recounted the attack. They arrived quickly this time, but once again, Max had disappeared into the night. The Rangers searched the area but found no trace of him. The police were involved again, but there was little they could do without solid evidence or a clear threat. They couldn't take action. They warned Max to stay away, but it did nothing to ease my fear. The remaining week of my stay was a living nightmare. Every moment was filled with dread. Every shadow a potential threat. I barely slept, barely ate, constantly on edge, waiting for Max to return. When the time finally came to leave, I felt a mix of relief and sorrow. I had come here seeking peace and solitude, but Max had tainted it, turning my dream into a nightmare. As I drove away from Gold Mountain, I couldn't help but cry, not because I was leaving, but because I was finally free from the terror that had haunted my every moment. But even as I left, a part of me knew the fear would follow. Max's words, his twisted face, his relentless pursuit, they would haunt me forever. The dream I had once cherished was now a ghost, a reminder of the darkness that can lurk even in the most beautiful places. What I'm about to tell you is something I still go to therapy for. It happened back during the summer of 2008. I started going to therapy around the start of 2010, and I've been going ever since. It wasn't my idea, it was my parents'. In a way, the only reason I still go is to keep them from worrying themselves sick over me. Not that I don't derive some small benefit from it, but what I tell my parents, my therapist, and I talk about, and what we actually talk about, are two very different things. Around the start of the holiday season, back in 2008, I was a sophomore Earth Sciences student at UC Davis. The university offers some summer placements to students who want to gain a little work experience. And although they're mostly dreary research assignments, I happened to come across one that piqued my interest in a way the others didn't. In short, I had the opportunity to spend the summer working as a fire lookout in the Trinity National Forest. It was a 3-month-long placement, but I'd be paid for my time, and completing a piece of long-term field research would look very good on my resume. I applied, I was accepted, and several months later, I was told that I'd be posted to the Tomad Mountain Lookout, which was about 30 miles west of the city of Red Bluff and about 130 miles north of Sacramento. Since I didn't own a car back then, I had to catch a bus all the way up to Red Bluff. From there, I hitchhiked along Route 36 and then hiked up into the hills until I reached the flat-top peak of Tomad Mountain where the old fire lookout tower stood. The first thing that struck me was that the 20-foot-tall lookout tower was made of wood. I figured a fire lookout tower would have been built with less flammable materials, but since it had been constructed back in the 30s, I guess wood was all they had at hand. It didn't make for the best first impression. After all, that tower was supposed to be my home for the next 3 months. But in the end, I managed to get myself settled in, and the place started to feel more cozy than decrepit. A big part of the assignment involved what we call numerical weather predictions, NWP. I won't bore you with the exact science of it, but it's somewhat similar to the kind of prediction models that allow news channels to give long-term weather forecasts. In the context of being a fire lookout, we can use these same models to predict the dry spells or heat waves that might result in a wildfire, because prevention is always better than a cure. Working on weather analysis kept me occupied for a precious few hours each day, while hydration became an important aspect of my daily routine. But outside of maintaining myself and my equipment, I had very little to keep me occupied. To kill time, I'd go for walks in the woods surrounding the lookout tower. Sometimes I'd visit the abandoned miner's cabin, sometimes the old campground that lay just beyond it. I'd keep my bear spray with me, just in case I had any close encounters of the furry kind. But I never, ever saw any people around. At first, the seclusion was a welcome escape from the hustle and bustle of the big city. And by the end of the first week, my social battery had been thoroughly recharged. But by the end of week 2, once the boredom had really started to set in, I found myself just pining for human contact in a way that was very much surprising to me. I had my old Samsung cell phone with me, along with a very efficient solar-powered cell phone charger, but the lack of solid coverage meant it was more useful as a paperweight. If I walked up to this one spot on the ridgeline, I could manage to squeeze the odd text message through, but any sort of phone call was out of the question, and that was something I hadn't anticipated. It sounds foolish to think about it now, but I figured that since I was so high up on a mountain, getting decent cell reception wouldn't be an issue, whereas in actuality, it was all about your proximity to towers. Communicating through the odd text message was all well and good, but by the end of that first month, being the only living soul for miles really started to grind on me. When a Trinity Forest Ranger showed up with my second month's supplies, I was so happy to see her that I almost hugged her when she stepped out of her 4x4. She could tell how happy I was to see her, and she joked about me going a little stir-crazy up there, all in my lonesome. She was nice enough to stay a while and drink some of my bad coffee. Then, once I'd hauled my supplies from her trunk, she drove off into the sunset. After that, knowing I wouldn't see another person in the flesh for a whole month actually made me kind of emotional. You don't realize what social animals we are until you really cut yourself off from other people. I once read that in prison, solitary confinement is one of the cruelest punishments. By my second month, I'd be out on one of my regular walks and I'd see something move out of the corner of my eye. But then when I turned to look, nothing. There's a lot of wildlife out there in Trinity, so for the first half dozen times it happened, I figured it was just a fox or a raccoon or something skittering away from me, frightened. But then after a while, the shadows in the corners of my eyes started getting larger and clearer, until eventually they weren't just in my periphery anymore. I'd see something moving in the trees up ahead of me, too big to be a bobcat or mountain lion, the wrong shape to be an elk or deer. I'd stop, look, listen, but nothing ever moved. Nothing ever stirred. And by the time I started to call out hello into the empty woods ahead of me, I developed a genuine concern for my own psychological well-being. I tried a dozen different things to lessen the feelings of loneliness and isolation, and although talking to myself might make it sound like I lost my mind, I can assure you that it helped. Pouring my thoughts out onto this page helped too, as did singing my favorite songs. After a day or two of accentuating the positives and eliminating the negatives, I began to feel considerably better. But then came the day when, as I set off on one of my routine walks through the woods, I caught a glimpse of a human figure standing among the trees. I turned my head to look in their direction, and like all the other things I'd seen moving in the corner of my eyes, this person didn't dart off among the trees. Quite the opposite, in fact. They remained as still as a statue, limbs very rigid, completely unmoving. In all honesty, the person's sudden presence scared the crap out of me, and the odd, unnatural way that they were standing did not help either. But then, the more I stared at this mysterious figure standing stationary among the trees, the more I realized that it wasn't a person at all. I could think of a dozen innocent reasons why someone might do such a thing, but still, there was something about the effigy's presence that just didn't sit right with me. This probably sounds incredibly juvenile to some, but as I stood there, face to wooden face with the mysterious effigy, I was suddenly filled with the overwhelming urge to knock it over. I didn't like the idea of going about my business and having this twig man just standing there looking all creepy like he was. It's never something I do now, but I obviously can't speak for the much younger college-age me who raised a hand, reached out, and prepared to knock the thing off its little stubby feet. But I also remember this feeling of intense hesitation as I reached out to touch it, how it almost felt like I was desecrating some sacred sculpture. The sensation halted me in 1 second, but in the next it felt like a challenge. Then, with one heavy stone, I sent the effigy falling back into the dirt with a little dry thud. In the moments that followed, I felt the hairs on my arms standing on end as I was struck by the sudden cognizance that whoever planted that twig man might still actually be close by. I looked around, then over both shoulders, making sure the coast was clear. I don't believe in any kind of sixth sense, but if there ever was a time in my life when I felt like I was being watched, it was then. I decided not to finish my walk that day and headed back to the tower to make sure that I had that second can of bear spray handy. I wouldn't say that I was scared, more apprehensive of what the effigy's sudden presence might actually mean. I later considered the possibility that some renegade artist with a little penchant for hiking might have mocked that thing up on the fly. At first, I had this irrational image in my head of some unhinged redneck hauling the completed effigy up to the mountain like a character from an unwritten Thomas Harris novel. But the alternative, that it was a spur-of-the-moment creative thing, was a considerably less unnerving explanation. No one had put that thing there to spook me. They probably didn't even know that I was in the area to begin with. The more I thought on that, the more I felt strangely guilty for having shoved it over. The next morning, I decided to head out on one of my morning routines, and while I was at it, I'd stake that twig man back into the earth and just leave him upright, just as I'd found him. I completed that morning routine, jotted down a few early morning weather observations, and then set off in the direction of Tomad Springs with some soap and a washcloth. When I reached the spot where the twig man had been lying in the dirt, I was startled to find him standing upright again. Someone had returned, possibly in the middle of the night, and had returned that twig man to his vertical position. Again, I wasn't outright frightened by this, just more unnerved. I also figured that if it was me who made the twig man, this silent companion I could go visit on hikes, I'd also be kind of bummed if some jerk came along and just pushed him over. Besides, if he was someone else's silent but stoic companion, maybe he could be mine too. I gave myself a scrub down at the springs, made my way back to the lookout, passing the twig man as I went, and then spent the rest of the day making weather observations and reading the books that I brought with me. Then, once the sun went down and my very early bedtime approached, I climbed into my sleeping bag and attempted to catch some shut-eye. I think I might have just been on the cusp of drifting off when a deeply alarming scent began to drift into my nostrils. It was the smell of smoke. I leapt out of my sleeping bag, threw on my shorts and boots, then was about to radio the ranger office over in Redding when a flicker of flame in the woods below caught my eye. The fire was close, very close, and by the look of things, it was still small enough for me to fight. I grabbed the tower's small fire extinguisher, rushed down the stairs, and then bolted towards the source of the fire. If I could put it out there, and then I'd not only save the state of California hundreds of thousands of dollars, but I'd also save acres upon acres of protected forest. I ran as fast as my legs could carry me, and then when I saw what was burning, I experienced one of the strangest sensations of my entire life. It was the twig man. That's what was burning, and although I carried on hurtling towards it, I'd never seen anything so repellent in all my life. The desire to put the damn thing out and prevent a potentially massive forest fire, that thought alone kept propelling me through the woods. But upon considering the dual questions of who set the twig man on fire to begin with and why, that was the first moment of fear. After putting out the fire, I got to thinking about who or what might be to blame. I couldn't rule out vandalism as being the motivator, but even the most thoughtless of vandals would think twice before setting a wildfire in a national forest. I also couldn't rule out the possibility that the person who had set the twig man on fire was the same person who put him there in the first place. I doubted very much that someone who'd taken the time to create such a sculpture would also be willing to burn the entire forest down. The very nature of the twig man suggested its creator felt a reverence for nature, not a contempt for it. But in turn, that raised another question. What if the twig man's creator set him on fire because they knew I'd come running to put him out? Since I was just a few days from my second and final resupply, the same ranger who had visited me the previous month decided to head up to the mountain a little early, both to drop off my supplies and check out the remains of the twig man. When she got there and I walked her out into the woods, there wasn't much left of him to look at, but the sight of him provoked a very familiar reaction from the ranger. She had all the same questions I did, but all that mattered was that I dealt with the fire both quickly and professionally. In her words, I should have been very proud of myself. For the next few days, I felt perfectly content to be alone. It was like the fire and the praise I'd gotten for my decisive action had topped up my social gas tank, so to speak, satisfying that crucial third layer in Maslow's hierarchy of needs. When I went on my regular walks, I didn't see any shadows moving in the corners of my eyes. I wasn't overcome by that creeping feeling that I was being watched. I felt at peace, both within and without, and that was the start of my third and final month up on the mountain. But towards the end of it, that same dread-inducing feeling that I was losing my mind returned with a vengeance. Having finished all of the books that I brought with me, and having grown sick of journaling my own pressingly repetitive stream of consciousness, I was even more plagued by tedium than ever. On the surface, this seemed to lead to a drastic decline in my mental health. I started seeing things again, like people moving in the woods, and the encroaching sense of paranoia resulted in a handful of completely sleepless nights. The exhaustion I began to feel exacerbated every other symptom, until at one stage, I started to wonder if I could complete the full 3-month term. I tried as best I could to power through, taking things a day and a night at a time, until finally I had just 7 more nights to go. I tried to mark the occasion with a minor celebration and opened up a can of warm soda that I had been saving for a very metaphorical rainy day. Then, after an evening spent trying to keep my spirits high, I settled down to sleep. 1 down, 6 to go, I told myself. But I couldn't have been more wrong. Hours later, I think maybe around 1 or 2 in the morning, I opened my eyes and heard what sounded like something moving among the trees below my tower. It was a very heavy sound, like something large and bipedal was stomping through the underbrush. Seeing as that was a zoological impossibility, I decided to climb out of my sleeping bag and go take a look. Having picked up my flashlight on the way out, I aimed its beam down into the darkness below me, and in an instant, I saw them. To my horrified astonishment, I discovered that the tower I was in was surrounded by at least a dozen hooded figures. Beneath me, just out of sight at the base of the tower, was the source of the noise that I'd been hearing. As alarming as the encounter was, I didn't immediately understand the significance of the stranger's presence. There was always the possibility that they were simply a group of late-night hikers who happened to cross the tower and were merely curious. But when I called out to them and asked them to identify themselves, I didn't hear a word in reply. I took a few steps out and then headed down the stairs a little so I could see what was occurring at the base of the tower, which, if you remember, was only around 10 to 15 feet down. More hooded figures stood below me, and the sound that they were making came from the fact that they were stacking large bales of twigs underneath the tower. It was kindling. They were going to set the tower on fire with me inside of it. The first thing I thought to do was rush back into the cabin to report what was happening via my radio. While I was doing that, I threw on my clothes and boots, grabbed my flashlight and my survival knife, then walked out onto the balcony just in time for the fire to start. I didn't waste a second. I ran along to where the stairs were, then went down 2 or 3 flights so that the fall wouldn't break my legs. I figured I'd have to jump, as whoever was surrounding the lookout would probably be expecting me to head down the stairs once they set the fire to it. Since they seemed perfectly content to roast me alive in what amounted to a very serious crime, I figured that they wouldn't be too excited about me escaping the scene. I remember jumping, knocking the wind out of myself, then being almost certain that I had just sprained an ankle until I put weight on it. Somehow, I was fine, and I also took the nearest hooded figure to me by surprise, which in turn gave me this brief but golden opportunity to slip past him. If I moved at speed, I honestly thought that I was about to get shot or stabbed or whatever, and I guess the person I ran at nearly did get me with something, but it was a stun gun. As I ran past them, they lunged at me, and I saw this little tiny bolt of lightning dancing in the air for a split second before I slipped past them and made my escape. I remember hearing this furious scream from someone screaming about me getting away, but by then, I was long gone, half running and half sliding down the mountain as fast as I could in complete darkness. I was lucky not to fall and accidentally kill myself, but there was no catching me. I made it all the way down the mountain without seeing so much as a flashlight behind me. I ran and ran until I was too tired to run anymore. Then, after what seemed like hours upon hours of rummaging through the brush, I came across a little place calling itself the Rocky Ridge Hunting Club, along with a small group of hunters preparing to take advantage of the dawn's calm. By that point, the sky was so light that I could point out the plume of smoke rising from Tamad Mountain, and within the hour, choppers were making passes over the lookout, creating artificial rain while the ground-based fire crews rushed to the scene. I should have felt exhausted. I should have been dead on my feet, but when I saw that first chopper fly over us, heading in the direction of Tamad Mountain, I felt 10 feet tall. I'd made it to that hunting club just in time to avert a major ecological disaster, and I felt like a hero. But I was not treated like one. Even after I explained everything that had happened with the Twig Man, with the hooded figures, with the fires, it was me who got the blame for burning down the Tamad Mountain lookout. According to the fire crews, there was no evidence of an accelerant being used, but it was impossible to tell if the source of the fire had been inside or outside the cabin. I guess it was my preposterous explanation that swayed the opinions of the Forest Service, but on their command, I was arrested on charges of arson, endangerment, and destruction of government property. My defense attorney told me that I dodged being charged with a serious environmental crime by the skin of my teeth, Tofgak, the kind that's only one step down from outright terrorism. She also told me that my best option by far was to basically plead temporary insanity at my trial. She made it out like I was some upstanding citizen who'd merely been unfortunate enough to have suffered a kind of psychiatric crisis as a result of severe and prolonged isolation. I pleaded guilty, got 100 hours of highway trash picking, and a mandatory psychiatric evaluation at the behest of the state of California. I tried to get my parents to believe me, but unfortunately, they took my attorney's arguments as gospel and instead of the truth, chose to believe that I'd gone temporarily crazy. But unlike my attorney, whose interest ended once the money dried up, Mom and Dad wouldn't let it go. They hounded me and hounded me until eventually I gave in and agreed to go to regular counseling sessions. I didn't want to take pills for something I knew that I didn't have, so to them, therapy was the next best thing. But these days, I don't talk to my therapist about how I'm scared to lose my mind again or how it might be a symptom of a much more frightening form of disease. I talk to him about how painful it can be when you tell someone the absolute truth and they choose not to believe you for the sake of their own sanity.